I'm Lucy.
And I'm Jennifer.
You're listening to Everything I Know About.
Each week, we share everything we know about a new topic, equipped with some internet research and a little too much exposure to pop culture.
Hi, everyone. Jennifer is out today. She is busy with our startup as our sole software engineer since we're very close to launch. But I do have a special guest as my co-host for today. This is my husband, Avery, who has come up in many of our episodes prior to this. He was the inspiration for our male-coded media episode and obviously very central to the thoughts I shared in our love, matchmaking, and monogamy episode, as well as the motherhood decision episode. So I'm really excited he's here and was willing to do this. And he is really nervous. In fact, he just chugged a glass of wine right before this. So the setup today is a little untraditional because obviously we're here together in person, whereas normally Jennifer and I record remote. She's in Nashville and I'm in New York City. And we also have wine, so it should be fun. How are you feeling, Avery?
I feel good. I'm nervous. I've never recorded anything before. I didn't know I was the inspiration for the male-coded media episode. I don't know if that's good or bad.
Yeah, did you not listen to that episode?
When I listened to it, I wasn't like, oh, this is because my husband does these things.
I mean, I literally say, Avery inspired this episode because he listens to so much male-coded media. So maybe you need to listen a little more closely.
I'm excited. I've been a listener of the pod. I edit most of the episodes, or I get a pre-listen.
I mean, you're not editing. I'm editing.
Fair. Yeah, I don't edit it. I listen.
So I can't believe this is our 25th episode. Thank you to all of our listeners, whether you've been here from day one or this is your first episode. It just means so much to Jennifer and I that you spend 40 minutes of your time each week listening to us. And over the next several weeks, we may be changing our release schedule a bit just because we are also launching a business. And hopefully we'll get to share more about that exciting news on the pod soon. But we might do a couple weeks where we release episodes every other week, just until we get through this initial startup launch. So for updates on that, follow us on socials at EikaPod, that's EIKA pod, or patreon.com/everything I know about pod. As we get closer to launch, Jennifer is also going to come to New York and stay with me. And so hopefully we'll get a few more in-person recorded video sessions as well. For today's episode, given Avery is here, I wanted to do an episode about fusion in its many forms. I'm using fusion here in kind of an untraditional way, but I'm talking about like fusion when it comes to people, as in us in an interracial marriage, fusion in cuisine, as well as fusion in music. So yeah, I just really wanted to create an episode talking about all of the interesting ways cultures have collided to produce the America we know today. And this is our ode to the quote unquote melting pot that is America, and a kind of tongue-in-cheek way of participating in a small slice of the race and identity conversation. Of course, race is a huge topic, and we are not going to even attempt to cover it in this one episode, let alone from just my perspective as an Asian American woman or Avery's as a white Jewish man. And we aren't trying to. This is what it's been like for us being in an interracial marriage, and to share some research that we both did around the beauty of when cultures mix and interact.
Let's do it.
Okay, so to start us off, the initial inspiration behind this episode was I was thinking back to when I saw this issue of National Geographic magazine when I was in college. It came out October 2013, and it was called The Changing Face of America. And on the cover was this photo of this beautiful ethnically mixed woman. Do you remember seeing this?
I think everyone remembers it. She had like these very intoxicating green eyes. It was nice.
Yeah, those intoxicating green eyes, huh? Okay, so you thought she was very attractive.
It was like an anthropology context. So I don't think you walk away being like, wow, I'd love to date that woman. It's just like, oh, wow, that person's good looking.
Yeah, for sure. She's extremely beautiful. Partially, I think why that magazine cover sticks out so clearly in my mind is because she was really gorgeous. And I don't even know if I read the actual article, but I remember they were giving us this image of this woman because that was supposed to be what humans would look like in 2050. The point being that we are becoming much more racially mixed as a society, and one day whites will not be the majority. And so I revisited that article and wanted to look at the actual data behind what are the trends, because as someone who is in an interracial relationship, in an interracial marriage, this is something that, what?
Usually you lead with marriage and not relationship, but it is an interracial relationship as well.
Okay. The reason I led with that is because when we initially started dating, as I think any couple, when they initially start dating and they're like trying to get to know each other, race definitely plays a role. Like I remember on our first date, we went on this hike in San Francisco and race heavily featured in that conversation. Do you remember?
Let's say yes for the sake of the conversation. Why don't you remind me what exactly we talked about?
Well, literally, we talked about like your family values versus my family values. How growing up Chinese American for me, I felt kind of excluded from a lot of the American traditions around holidays, large family gatherings, since I only have my nuclear family here. And then also just because of the one child policy, like I don't have a large extended family. And we talked about that on our first date.
That conversation I do remember. And I think probably we shared some commonality where it was like, okay, I was raised Jewish, but I have this non-Jewish last name and I raised in like a non-Jewish area. And I think probably there was a lot of commonality there around like some amount of otherness around identity and things like that. So yeah, does ring a bell.
Yeah, exactly. And I think when we were growing up, so we both grew up in Michigan in neighborhoods that were majority white. I certainly felt like I was in the minority and most of my friends were Asian. It felt difficult to become friends with people of other races because at least my personal experience, it was pigeonholed like, okay, the Asian kids all hang out together. Did you have any experiences like that?
When I think about growing up in the area we grew up in, I think about it being quite diverse. The birthday parties that I remember going to were mostly people that spoke non-English in their house. I'm not saying that that is the world's most diverse environment, but like to be exposed to that at such a young age, right? I remember like my first soccer team, age 6, was at least a third or a half not white people.
I just did a quick Google and like the town I grew up in is 4% Asian. So I do think you are pretty unique in the fact that you, even today, most of your friends are Indian. But I think that's like pretty unique that you actively sought out to be friends with those communities because I think definitely my experience in school was like people tended to hang out with their race. And an even smaller minority was mixed race kids. And I do remember like there was this one girl who was in my friend group who was half Asian, half white. And it being such a interesting thing that everybody treated her differently because she wasn't just Asian, she was also white. And like everyone thought she was so hot and attractive. And me as a 100% Chinese girl growing up, but only seeing these Western standards of beauty, like big eyes, blue eyes, whatever, I'd always felt like, oh, if only I like looked more white, if only I had more westernized features, I would feel more beautiful. And looking at this half Asian, half white girl being like, wow, that's the ideal because she has that mix that everyone thinks is so cool. And I feel like as we've gotten older, it just feels much more common that there's a lot more mixed race children. Now we live in New York City. When I walk down the street, usually the couples that I'm seeing are mixed race. It feels like a really high percentage. And so I was curious, what is the actual reality? So the US Census obviously collects this data. And actually only since 2000 have they collected data on multiracial people, because that's when the census first allowed you to check off more than one race. And at that point, 6.8 million people chose to do so. 10 years later, in 2010, that number jumped by 32%. Most recently, in 2020, that increased by 276% to 34 million people, which is 10% of the US population. So it is the fastest growing category. And I just find it super fascinating that it was only 50, 60 years ago that interracial marriage even became legal through the Supreme Court case.
Is it actually true that mixed race marriages were illegal 50 years ago? Is that in 1970s?
Yeah, 100% true. Interracial marriage became legal in all states in the US in 1967 with the Supreme Court case Loving versus Virginia. Prior to that, there were states with anti-miscegenation laws. Primarily, this was to prevent blacks and whites from marrying. But yeah, it's literally only been 60 years. And what I find fascinating is how attitudes have shifted so much. This poll from Gallup showed that in 1958, So a couple years before the Supreme Court case, the approval of interracial marriage was at 4%. And in 2021, it was at 94%.
I mean, that's amazing. That's like a swing from 0 to 100, right? In the course of 50 years. Like, I don't think that you could find any other topic in American society where people unanimously change their mind in that way. That's shocking, right? I mean, 0 to 100% it's not the kind of thing that you would expect to ever happen.
I was honestly so surprised too, and I wanted a comparison. So I looked up the amount of Americans that approve of gay marriage, which only became legal in all states in 2015. And currently, approval of gay marriage in the US is around 70%. And we don't have the same 50, 60-year history just because they didn't have survey data for 1950s, but they did have it for 1996. And around that time, it was around 30%.
I guess in general, these are just very encouraging stats, right? There's a lot of discourse today that like, oh, people are stodgy and they're stuck in their views and America is totally divided. It'll never be any different way. But these are instances of people totally changing their mind about like pretty consequential things.
Yeah, and with interracial marriage in particular, it's not just that 94% of Americans, as an average, approve of interracial marriage. There's actually nearly universal approval across generations. So even older people, their attitudes have shifted. It's not just that younger people are more liberal and it's like pushing the number across races and even by region. So a lot of states that you would think would be more conservative actually also have nearly universal approval. So yeah, I think it's actually very encouraging. As of today, 20% of marriages are interracial. 1 in 5 is huge. You got to imagine that like as everyone just becomes more mixed, like literally, according to the US Census, non-Hispanic whites are projected to no longer be the majority of the US population in 2045. So, I mean, obviously like pure majority minority doesn't erase everything. Like we're still going to have the legacy of slavery and Japanese internment and all of the things that happened in our history. But at least from a voting perspective, majority-minority really matters. So yeah, I do think hopefully if the majority of people are non-white, that will change our politics and shape which leaders we elect and the policies that come out of that.
I think it like bodes well for the future of, if not the world, this country, right? Like if you enter a multiracial marriage, you cannot help but become 1% more open-minded. Like it's impossible to become less open-minded. And I think that these trends, I personally see them as like a good sign for kind of like the perhaps divisiveness in like America today that can seem really depressing.
Do you think at all about the fact that if we were to have kids, how difficult it may or may not be for them growing up?
I mean, the thing that I think most about is like, how can I make sure my kids play in the NBA, you know?
Okay, I'm 5'3", that will never happen.
There's a chance. There's a chance.
Babe, you're like 5'11". Like you just found out you're not even 6 foot at your annual physical. They were like, actually, you're slightly short of 6 foot.
That's true. The place where it comes up is when we talk about like, oh, if we had kids, like what, well, obviously they would speak English at home. That's a joke to think they would speak something else, but what would their traditions be? And like,
wait, what does that mean? I speak Mandarin.
What would you do? Like point to things and say nouns to the...
Okay, this is actually a joke in our house. My Mandarin is very poor. I would say I'm at the level of maybe a first grader. So he's making a comment about my actual language ability here, not a dislike for Mandarin as a language.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about this, right? Like, if we had kids, what would we want that experience to be like? Because traditions matter, right? This is like your childhood. This is your life, right? And I think in that sense, we talk about it a lot.
Yeah, you mean more like making sure our kids feel both their Chinese American identity and also their Jewish identity through like the celebrations, the food, maybe not the language, if only maybe I can improve this by the time I have kids, but through all these elements to make them feel like they truly can claim both cultures.
I think less about the idea of like claiming cultures as like having a sense of identity that they feel comfortable with. How would we create an environment that we were excited to raise kids in, or like that they would be excited to be a part of themselves, even if it's not necessarily like, there's not a long history of Jewish Chinese tradition to like bring up kids in, right? So it's more a discussion of what might that look like.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's only so much we can control, though. I think there's the environment you create for your kids when they're young and not yet in school, and then there's the world. And the reality is when they go into school or they interact with the outside world, you're not going to be able to control how other people view them. I mean, I think literally as more mixed race kids are born, I feel like I've seen a lot more content about parents learning how to deal with having the race conversation with their children. when the George Floyd murder happened, how do you talk to your kids about that? For example, if the mom was white and the dad was black, the mom never having navigated this reality of being black in America, and now she has kids who are black. How do you have that conversation? You can raise them in this super loving environment that's very racially sensitive, racially aware, but as soon as they go anywhere, they're going to be perceived as a black person in America and all of the danger that comes with that. I think for our situation, our kids are going to look Asian. Brown eyes are dominant to blue eyes. Black hair is dominant to blonde hair. Have you thought about what it will be like to raise mixed race Asian children?
I think it's definitely an unknown, right? How would you know what this experience is like before you've done it? Sure, you can read books, or in my case, we even had neighbors growing up that were white man, Japanese woman, mixed kids. So it doesn't feel that crazy, but there are certainly lots of unknowns, right? I mean, they will have experiences that I've never had, that you've never even had. And that's something that if we have kids, we'll have to work through. Ideally, we can make sure that they're part of a community and that hopefully there are more cultural reference points that they can relate to in their childhood. But obviously, there would be many unknowns. And I think probably a lot of surprises for me, right?
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's a lot of unknowns, but there's also a lot of the experiences already shared by mixed race children out there. From my mixed race friends, I would say the most common thread that I've heard is that it just feels like you're not accepted by any world, and your identity is not enough to belong into one group or the other. I actually, as I was reading the National Geographic article, saw this other project that this reporter, Michelle Norris, did called the Race Card Project. It was this 10-year project where she printed out all these postcards that said, "Race, your thoughts, 6 words," and asked people to mail them back to her. And she got so many responses, and eventually she also started collecting them via the web. But I pulled some of the quotes because I thought they were really powerful. So here are a few. "My mixed background means white enough. He's my dad, not the gardener. My name and skin don't match. Not biracial, not mixed, just human. I'm only Asian when it's convenient." Do you have any reactions?
To my earlier point about there being a lot of unknowns, I think the biggest one that this kind of makes clear is that I don't have 6 negative words that reflect my lived experience, whereas a lot of these people do, right? It's either a complex identity or some way where society judged them, and I don't have that.
Yeah, that's real. I mean, when I think about if someone were to ask me what my 6 words would be, it's interesting because when I think about my race at this age, now I'm 30, I'm really proud to be Chinese American. But when I think about how long it took me to get to that point, a lot of my memories are really fraught with struggle. And I mean, obviously, I'm not even mixed race, so I can't imagine the struggle of having 2 different identities where you don't feel like you belong. But I feel like my 6 words would probably try to reflect that transition from feeling ashamed of my identity to now embracing it. Race has played such a huge role in my life. And when I think about my kids having to also navigate that world because they're going to be Asian American kids, they can't pass as white. I mean, I feel like my kids are going to actually have a more similar experience to my upbringing, to the world I grew up in than the world you grew up in.
But all these stats, right, they point to a large shift in American society around becoming more multi-ethnic at the family level. And it doesn't take that many peers that are like you to feel part of a community.
Yeah, I hope so. I'm very optimistic. I don't know. Jennifer's not here because usually she's the pessimistic take and she's like, "Lucy, you're so naive." But I am optimistic for our children's generation. As we become more mixed as a society, I feel like only good things happen. Avery's like, "Why are you tying this race conversation with the concept of fusion?" But in my brain, they're very, very linked because so many good things we get in our culture, in food and music, are because of this fusion in society. And I've always heard it described as America is a melting pot, and that being a good thing when I was growing up. But I only recently learned that now melting pot has fallen out of favor as a term, and that it's seen as a negative thing because it's more like all these cultures coming together, becoming monoculture, like you're losing your culture and becoming part of the American culture. And now the preferred term is salad bowl, where you still keep some of your unique identity.
That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my whole life. Okay, so in the last few years, we've left the US a few times for different reasons. And every time I come back, my first feeling when I come back is wow, it just sucks here. It's so dirty, nothing works, the trains don't run on time. And the thing that always picks me back up is like there are people from everywhere on earth that live here and like somehow it's working. And there's nowhere else that you really go that's like that. Nowhere. I think whatever's happening there, whatever sort of food you want to call it, salad bowl, melting pot, like that's one of the things that is undeniably working for America is the ability to bring lots of different people together.
As soon as you touch down at the airport in New York, you hear 8 different languages being spoken. And you don't get that in other places. It's just much more homogenous. And so that brings me to all of the wonderful results of this American fusion. And I really wanted to talk about fusion in cuisine. I feel like it's gone through these really interesting waves. So when I was in college, that's when the sushi rito was invented. Do you know what that is?
It seems to kind of speak for itself. I've never eaten one, but I can imagine what it would be like.
Yeah, so it was created in San Francisco in 2011. That was the time when it was suddenly very cool to have food fusion. And you saw all of these really interesting combinations.
Would you say it all started with Buffalo Wild Wings Asian Zing? Or would you say that was before or after?
I mean, I'd order Asian Zing. It did appeal to my taste buds. Were you ordering it?
I think we're going to have to cover this in another episode because it was not the best flavor on the menu. So
okay, that's very debatable. I think it was very good. Anyway, so during this period, there was this like rise in food fusion being very cool. And then it kind of fell from grace. The popular attitude on it became, this food does not actually taste good. This is kind of a marketing gimmick.
I mean, what falls under Asian fusion food? Exhibit A, sushi rito, but like what else are we talking about here?
Vietnamese tacos.
Vietnamese tacos are actually pretty good.
So this brings me to the next wave, which I feel like is only in the last couple of years, where now there's a bunch of restaurants. I mean, also we live in New York, and obviously the New York food scene is very good, but there's now a bunch of new restaurants opening that are fusion, and they're very good. And they tend to be higher end. So this is not like your fast casual sushi rito. This is a sit-down meal where you're going to have Peruvian Japanese food, or you're going to have Korean Cajun food, or like Arab Latin. And there's these really interesting, very well thought out dishes where they're bringing like ingredients, cultural elements of these different cuisines together. And I've been seeing a lot more articles and food critics now praising this new iteration of fusion.
It's probably because the food is just better though. It was tried, it was okay, and it's come back around and now it's like genuinely very good.
So I looked into this, and the original fusion trends started in the 1980s, 1990s. A handful of French-trained celebrity chefs started adding these exotic ingredients to their menus. One example is Wolfgang Puck, who opened this restaurant called Chinois in Santa Monica, which is hilarious to me because Chinois just means Chinese in French. It has a menu of French, Chinese, and Californian ingredients. At the time, this was considered an elevation of ethnic food because food culture is very Eurocentric. Like French cuisine has always been seen as the epitome of fine dining. Literally, Michelin stars are mostly awarded to European restaurants. So the original fusion wave were these white celebrity chefs opening these fancier restaurants. Then around the time we were in middle and high school, the early aughts, you've got Momofuku and David Chang. You've got Roy Choi and his Korean taco truck. They're celebrities too now. But at the time, they were the upstarts, and they were ethnic chefs making their food with an untraditional spin, expanding the price point at which you can get fusion food. And it was really exciting. I think this is why there was such a boom around fusion, because you did have chefs who were doing it really well. Then I would say the tail end of that was the sushi rito, scraping the bottom of the barrel now. People realize what's selling and what consumers want, and they're just using it for marketing. And then as a person who did try a lot of these restaurants, when I first had some disposable income and realized that they weren't very good, I've been part of this chorus that fusion is just a gimmick and it's not actually good food. That also translated to this larger feeling that whatever's authentic is automatically better. For instance, authentic Chinese food was always going to be better than American Chinese food because that was made for Western palates and like not something I would call my people's food. And that idea only began to change recently when I started following this food personality, Lucas Sen. We both follow him.
I don't know who he is exactly. I just know that he has very good YouTube videos. He has a very good egg drop soup recipe that we employ once a month.
I started following him around the pandemic because he was making these really amazing Instagram stories just from his home kitchen, making Chinese American food. And now he's on Bon Appetit. He's fairly well known. But his background, he actually grew up in Hong Kong, which, I mean, so much of the food in Hong Kong is fusion by the nature of its history. He came to America for college. He actually went to Yale. And then he moved to New York and had 2 restaurants, both serving different iterations of Chinese American food. And there's this great quote from him. He says, "These days, there is sort of a dirty association with the word fusion, like it's forced and that sort of thing. But if you understand that fusion, or at the very least, cultural interconnectivity, is the very basis of how food develops and how traditions develop, then you would embrace fusion."
I think one thing that he seems to do really well is like, at the end of the day, the food just has to taste really good. And I think that he's much less opinionated about how you got to that point. He certainly loves to elevate the history, and I think that's a lovely part about what he does. The thing that he definitely brings to the table is like, if the food is good, the food is good. Whereas other people kind of miss that point a little bit.
Well, I think the thing that he also taught me was when things are considered lowbrow, you should really question that perception. Because I think Chinese American food has always been seen as really lowbrow, laden with MSG, greasy, something that's quick and cheap, but not something you're eating because it's healthy or it even tastes that good. But he was on this podcast called The Taste in November 2021, and I listened to it at the time and it really opened my eyes. As a person who grew up in Hong Kong, you would think he'd feel similar to me in that kind of snobby way, tasting Chinese American food, but he actually developed this appreciation both for like the business side of Chinese takeout restaurants as well as the culinary side, right? And on the business side, Chinese takeout is the most popular ethnic food in America. You can find it literally anywhere. And it's just amazing how they've scaled that up because there is no headquarters for Chinese takeout food. It's not like McDonald's where there's like someplace in Chicago where they're standardizing everything. And yet, if you order orange chicken or General Tso's chicken anywhere, it all tastes pretty much the same. So how did we all sync some sort of like Asian brainwaves, you know? And then the other point is like the restaurant business is such a hard business to make work. So many restaurants fail and the costs are very difficult to balance. Yet, there's so many Chinese restaurants out there that are still in business that have these 200-item menus. And like, how are they in business, right? And his point, because he's actually trained as a professional chef and he's worked in a lot of restaurants, and he was like, okay, Chinese restaurants, they don't have prep hours. If they're open from 11 a.m. to 9 p.m., that's it. Like, the chef shows up at 11. You have the front of house person who, yeah, she takes the phone orders, she greets the delivery guys. She's also like frying the egg rolls, plating the rice, doing all of the things that like in a traditional fine dining restaurant or even just a normal restaurant, like the host just seats the people, right? Like the host just does one job and you have the garde manger in the back doing the heating work or whatever. And he's like, that's why they just run such a lean operation, which me as a business person, I'm like, yes, like I appreciate that. And then on the culinary side of things, his point, which is also so fascinating, I think especially now that we live in New York, because I see this, is like Chinese takeout restaurants have done an incredible job of really adapting to their clientele. So in New York, specific dishes become very popular. So like ribs are a great example in New York. Ribs are really, really popular in Puerto Rican, Latin American neighborhoods in New York. This kind of like char siu ribs fusion. And I appreciate that so much, that Chinese American food has been able to really adapt and serve its clientele and like stay in business and make money for these like immigrant families who came and that was like their only source of income. So yeah, I mean, obviously I just spent a lot of time talking about Chinese American fusion in particular because that's where my interests lie. But I think we are seeing this renaissance of fusion food in general. I think it's being done the right way now, where we are seeing more and more people of color being able to open these restaurants that speak to their unique identities with food. And I would hope this is only going to increase because like our children, they're going to have a mixed cuisine that they grew up with, both Chinese and Jewish. And I would be very excited to see like a Chinese-Jewish fusion restaurant. Some pastrami fried rice.
There is one, Japanese-Jewish, in New York.
Have you been?
Williamsburg, yes.
I don't understand why you didn't take me. Who did you go with?
It was some kind of boys' night. You weren't invited, but it's good.
Okay, well, the truth is coming out now. Our last topic is to chat about fusion and music. So I'm really into food. I know a lot about food, but I know nothing about music. I don't even really listen to music. So I asked Avery to lead us because Avery has the most eclectic taste in music out of anyone I know. He listens to almost everything.
Growing up, we listened to a whole bunch of different genres, everything from jazz, bossa nova, rap, hip hop, kind of everything. And I guess I've continued doing that as an adult. So I listen to a lot of different stuff in maybe kind of a surface level way and don't go super deep, but definitely a lot of different genres. So one thing that I was looking at that was kind of interesting is if you look at the Billboard Top 100 from the last 1 or 2 years and then compare that to 10 years ago, just how different things are. So if you go back 10 years, right, the top 3 songs of 2013 were Macklemore's Thrift Shop, Blurred Lines, and then Imagine Dragons' Radioactive. But the thing that was not super present on that list was international music. So if you look at the most recent years of the Billboard Top 100, 2023 and 2022, by my count, there were at least 10 that are international artists, which is just a huge change from 10 years ago. In last year's list, you had K-pop, you had reggaeton, Mexican pop, Afrobeats in the songs that American people are enjoying and listening to.
So why do you think that is? Why has it changed so much?
It's tough to say why it's gotten so popular, but I do think maybe it's similar to the story with food, where, the quality of this newer stuff that's coming from international influences, international music in this case, is just really good. It's better dance music. It's fun to listen to. It's just a new sound. It's better than the stuff that it's replacing.
No, I mean, that's an interesting answer because I think so much of our music taste is not actually shaped by like what's objectively good. It's more just what gets airtime. I think a lot of what makes music successful is the behind the scenes machinations to get your music on the radio. I would imagine, like as a person who's not very familiar with this world, that there's been some sort of change. Like specifically with Afrobeats, it started with Nigerian music, where that started to get played more in America. And I don't know if that like is primarily fan driven. Oh, suddenly there was more of a demographic in the United States that was seeking that music out and becoming fans and requesting it, or if it's more top down, like record labels making deals with radio stations in the United States so that stuff gets played. And then I think it's like this cycle where if it gets played a lot, it becomes popular.
To me, it seems clear that the music is standing on its own merits, right? All of these artists are selling out concerts in the US. Tons of mainstream American artists are choosing again and again and again to feature these international artists on their songs to like great success.
Yeah, I wonder if there was one hit that really showed it had crossover potential. Like with K-pop, I'm thinking Gangnam Style.
Is Gangnam Style considered K-pop?
Yeah, 100%. Psy was not a known artist in the West, but he was a big artist in Korea. And that song came out, and I think it blew a lot of people's expectations out of the water that a song like that could be #1 in America, where there's not even a lot of English in the lyrics. And I think it did introduce, like growing up, I had friends, Chinese American friends who were into K-pop. And so even there's some cross-cultural appeal there because they didn't understand Korean. But I didn't know that many like white girls who were into K-pop. And now I feel like there's a lot of white girls who are into K-pop.
It is not uncommon today to have these international faces be at the, it's true in sports, it's true in culture. Like we won't even talk about sports, but like the NBA is a great example of this. Like if you take the top 10 guys in the NBA today, half, if not more, are not born in this country. So I think that like across the board, you're just seeing a multicultural wave in music, food, sports, everything that is year by year taking over the next thing that you didn't expect.
It's interesting when we look at these trends that came from outside of the United States, and it feels like we have fully embraced it. But then when I think about the recent controversy with Beyoncé entering country music, I think it's really different when it's like within our country, you have, let's say specifically with country, which is seen as a white genre, even though the roots of country are actually from enslaved Africans. There's this protectiveness over the genre and this feeling that for an outsider, quote unquote, to come in, you have to like prove yourself. And I mean, it does seem like the machine behind music in America is very open to songs, artists coming in from other international countries. But when it comes to recognizing the roots of quote unquote American music, that's much harder.
It does seem like people have always been criticizing artists for stepping outside of the box that they've been in. I mean, Kanye West he gets criticized for other things now, but back when he was choosing to make synthesizer music where he was singing, or he was choosing to make gospel music, people didn't like that. When Lil Wayne decided to make a guitar album, obviously not a great album, but he was criticized just for making a guitar album, which was maybe the wrong criticism. Right criticism was that it was just bad.
I think this came up for me because actually, Tracy Chapman's song Fast Car? That song was really popular when we were in college, and I loved that song. And I didn't realize that song came out in 1998. But in 2023, Luke Combs, this country singer, did a cover of Fast Car.
This is the one that was like at the Grammys this year. He did this cover and they did it together, and it was like a sentimental moment.
Yeah, well, before that, he came out with a cover of this song, and it actually ranked higher in the charts than her original ever got. And so I remember reading about this because it was like Tracy Chapman, she's a Black woman who wrote the song. And it was a hit for her, but like Luke Combs was still able to be more successful as a white man in country singing her cover of the song than she ever got credit for writing this country song. Because it's like country is just such a white music genre. And actually, Tracy Chapman, she became the first Black songwriter to win the Country Music Awards Song of the Year in 2023 after Luke Combs did this cover. And it took 35 years after she wrote the song initially for her to achieve that. And then when Beyonce announced that she was coming out with a country album, a lot of country radio channels were like, oh, Beyonce, like she doesn't sing country music, like we're not going to play her. And then her point has been country music is Black music. The history of country music is that it came from hymns that enslaved Africans would sing, and then it was featured in minstrel shows, which were these like very racist shows, and then derogatorily called hillbilly songs, and then became the country music that we know today, but then Blacks were excluded from that.
Artists are always going to be very deeply criticized for crossing their boundary, especially if the boundary is race charged. I guess the way I see it is like, if you're great, you don't give a shit, and like you just make music, and like those artists undeniably move the culture forward in a really significant way. To an artist like Beyonce, like there's not a writer in the world that could write something that would meaningfully damage her ability to make a great country album. Like she's one of the greatest artists of the last 100 years. There's no writer in Pitchfork or like anything that could spit on her shoes. It just doesn't matter. People who are not in the arena love to just have something to talk about. It's always been the case.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think there's always going to be haters for people who are just trying to change anything or do anything innovative. Especially like because America is such a racialized society where, yeah, in some ways it's a country of immigrants. We have so many cultures and races within us, but we also struggle with race, unlike most other countries where it is such an unequal society. And I think when we first talked about doing this episode, you were like, how are you going to tie racial identity to food and music? But I actually think they're so tied because like food and music, these are cultural expressions of how we express our racial identity. And we get amazing things by blending, as we've just spent the last 45 minutes talking about. But you also get so much pushback whenever you do try to cross boundaries and you do try to mix things because America is so racialized. America prefers to keep every race in its own category. Maybe now with the exception of interracial marriage, now that it is like a universally accepted thing.
I think my take from this episode is like, I think the backdrop is real, right? There's the people who like to keep their food in separate parts of the plate. And then there's the people who like to mix it together. And like society is mixing the plate to great benefit. Like pick your domain. Just the quality bar is going up really quickly. And it doesn't matter what you look at. Food, culture, music, sports. And the willingness to be multicultural and accept multiculturalism is like, if not the driving force, pretty high up there in a lot of ways. Like, sure, like technology, but like multiculturalism is one of the leading causes of all of these things.
Yeah, and clearly we are part of that movement. All right, I'm going to let Avery have the last word. Thanks so much for listening, guys. Bye.
Thanks for listening. See you later.
If you enjoy the pod, we would love for you to give us a follow and rate us on Apple Podcasts, which helps us get the word out and reach new listeners. Full transcripts and show notes are available on Patreon. where if you choose to become a patron, you'll also get access to bonus content, our monthly book club, and our eternal gratitude.
If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a topic for a future episode, email us at everythingiknowaboutpod@gmail.com or DM us across all socials at EikaPod, that's EIKA pod. Thanks for listening and see you next week.